in order for them to stop developing new oil palm plantations, which means they were so committed to it in terms of policies, in terms of programs, in terms of intervention funds, all kinds of incentives to grow that sector. But not just grow the sector, but look at the value chain in the entire sector. So, and with that, for example, this year it is projected that from the export of palm oil only, just one derivative of oil palm oil, Indonesia is expecting $18.6 billion just from the export of palm oil. Now, that is the kind of result you get when you look at value chains and then ask yourself, what must we do at each point of those value chains? What do they need? For example, people make reference to power, just like you discussed a short while ago. But not many people are aware that China went through the same process. That at some point in the last 20 years, China did not have adequate power for its industries. So what did they do? Common sense analysis and practice. All they said was that, look, we can channel energy to those economic activities that need them when we know they'll be open. So they come into an industrial park, which we call a cluster in this instance, and they inform them that, look, within the hours or so and so, you are going to have power. So what they did in such industries, and this is historical and documented. Now, if you have power between 7 p.m. and 7 a.m., all the factories within that cluster will only come to work in the night to produce. And so their workers are off during the day.
Kind of like what Bosin said.
Now, another cluster will have 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. So their own employees come to work in the morning, and they know they work through the day. So in the night, they are shut down.
But that's just one, because you see, you're looking at the power aspect of it. And, Bosin actually talked about it a few months ago.
Yes.
But you see, it also has, it's a hydra-headed issue.
It is.
So apart from power, you're looking at other infrastructure like road, transport.
Good.
And so you come in the night or within a certain hour, you do your business, then you also have to make sure that you have the option of taking your goods and products out.
Very good.
As well.
Now, but you see, where we are now in terms of recession, the truth of it is that spending is not coming from the private sector. So anytime an economy is in recession, the key to getting out of recession is for government to spend its way out of recession. But the question is, what will they spend on? But in our own position here, it is peculiar because we are not in a recession based on an industrial base that is strong. We don't have one. Which means what should take our attention at this moment is the informal sector. In which case, what do they need? Primarily, what they need can be put to three things. One is access to finance. An important one also is access to market. And then the third one is logistics, primarily. Now, if you talk about access to finance, that means they must be able to access the little money they require. Most of these businesses, as we talk now, in the informal sector, all they need is simply working capital. I mean, a company that needs 200,000, 500,000 naira, just like it came in the conversation earlier on with Boasin. Now, they don't need much in terms of their working capital requirements. So, and that means you need to have an intervention fund that is directed at that.
But then governance, funds.
Yeah, that is where I'm going. Now, governance is the key issue here. And like we have seen repeatedly in Nigeria, when you introduce intervention packages, it often got abused. So, but when those intervention schemes were abused, there was no sanction that followed for those that abused it. And so you see it happen again. So now, what we can define from now as a departure from the past is to look at any intervention scheme and define clearly what it's supposed to deliver. And then we have two things, monitoring, and then, of course, if it is abused in any way, there should be heavy sanction against its abuse. So and until we begin to do that, we will see a departure from the past. And that's what I would call business unusual.
Even if you're doing business unusual and you're talking about funds, the Central Bank of Nigeria has to come into play in this matter. The deposit money banks are also,
that's right,
have to come in as well. And then you also have to have the FIRS. Bosin also mentioned it, the Federal Inland Revenue Service, also coming into play in this particular part. Yes, but
interestingly too.
But there's still that issue of addressing the structural issues of getting proper monitoring an evaluation of the funds that you've taken? We've got so many intervention funds that I know that the Central Bank of Nigeria has come up with, the Bank of Industry, SMIDAN, you know, but it still seems as if we come back here and we're still saying the same thing. So it's almost like a monologue.
You see, until you have a structure in place that demands performance from those you give responsibility to. If you don't demand performance, it will be business as usual. And that is why I mentioned the issue of an evaluation of what has been done. And then if it is found that it is abused, there has to be a sanction. Sanction had never followed any abuse of those schemes in the past. Now, the man that took an intervention fund and instead of doing what he wrote on paper in terms of the request for it, he took the money and went to do something else. Nothing has happened till date. Okay? Now, until you have sanctions that will follow such abuses, you will get a repeat of the same thing. So, and that is why I call it governance. Very important here. Now, that is on the one side. Okay? That is what needs to change in regards to access to finance. Now, the second key thing here is access to markets. Now, in most of the countries that have grown and now developed, unlike us, we grew, but we didn't develop. What they had done was to ensure that the informal sector is restructured and reformed in a way that they have access to market.
But that's what they tried. I think that's what the former administration tried to do under President Goodluck Jonathan, try to restructure the informal sector in such a way that they will become, huge drivers of the economy.
My perspective to access to market is different than what Jonathan's administration did. My perspective of it is simply this. If I am a producer in the informal sector, all of my output, let's say in a batch, is valued at about 450,000 naira. Not really significant. But with that volume of business, I have 10 individuals behind me that are employed. Okay? Now, I've produced, but I need to dispose of those things and get the money back so that I can go to the next cycle of production. Now, when you talk about access to market, it's about how do I ensure that what I produce gets sold? Now, governments in other climes have had to intervene in this also. And how did they do that? We still have it even today, that even the most advanced countries, what they call subsidy for us here, and tell us, no, government should not subsidize anything. In their own climes, they subsidize in that manner by providing what they call a guaranteed market for what is produced by the informal sector. Now, the guaranteed market is what makes the farmer return to the farm after the harvest. That is what makes the manufacturer return to the factory. So, and these are the issues that are involved there.
Dr. Adedipe, we have to leave the conversation here, but that's not the end of it. Thank you so much for coming on the program this morning.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Business Morning continues in just a moment. Stay with us.